I can still picture that scene so vividly of her like rearing back and like punching this werewolf in the face. This has single-handedly changed the way I think about the world and how I exist in it. The writing is so good. Easily thousands and thousands of pages. What is up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today is an exciting one. We're talking about life-changing books. I started some notes, and I had like quite a few more than I realized. So I'm gonna take you through a few of those and hope that you find some good recommendations, or maybe some of these you have read and they've also changed your life. I'd be very interested to know that, actually, if you want to pop that in the comments. So we're gonna start from like the oldest ones that I remember from literally like elementary school, and then work my way up through to the ones that I've read most recently. So the first series that I remember just loving, being obsessed with, was The Land of Elyon. This was, I think, a 3-book series. I think it was a trilogy. And it was basically about a young girl who can speak to animals. She has some sort of magical like stone that allows her to communicate with animals, if I remember correctly. That is basically all I remember from them. I remember The Dark Hills Divide. I always thought that was such a cool title, and I loved the covers. They marketed them very well. I loved that art style. They just like fully enveloped me in their world, and they weren't really that long compared to what a lot of my friends were reading at the time. This would have been like 5th grade or something, so a lot of my friends were reading Harry Potter, which I got into actually a little bit later. I loved that sort of, I think it's supposed to be like medieval, or it's at least set at some point in the past. That whole time period was really fun to read about, and just the way that, you know, the literature, like the story is affected obviously by the time in which it's written, so like there being no technology and that kind of a thing. I just remember them being so cozy. So I highly recommend if you're wanting to ever read a children's series, because sometimes it's kind of a nice break, honestly, from like normal adult fiction that we're all reading. That's the first series that I really remember kind of like being obsessed with. And then the next series, I think it may have only been 2. I'm not sure if it was 2 or 3. If there was a 3rd one, I don't think I ever read it. I remember reading 2, and this was The Cry of the Ice Mark. Again, thought the covers were so cool. This one's definitely set in like medieval times. It's almost like a baby Outlander, sort of. You have like the flame-haired heroine, and she's bearing a sword, and she's riding horseback. She literally punches a werewolf in the face in the first chapter, and I remember being like, you feel like you're reading something like for adults. I was probably like a preteen at this point, and I just thought that was like the coolest thing that I'd ever read. I can still picture that scene so vividly of her like rearing back and like punching this werewolf in the face. That's pretty badass. So this was probably my first introduction into like the strong female character that has since become sort of a hashtag, but like there have always been strong female characters in books, at least all the ones that I grew up on. So this was really my first introduction into that, and now obviously I've moved on to things like Outlander and different books like that. But this was definitely my first introduction into that whole time period, into fantasy. I don't remember if there are dragons or not, but I remember the vibe, and I remember them being like page turners, and I was obsessed with them. Again, it's almost kind of like a baby Game of Thrones too, I would say. They were just so chock full of plot. They're a little bit thicker, and it's the type of book that just gets you into reading as a young, not even a young adult, basically as a kid. And then moving into my actual teenage years, so I think it was 2008, it was the year before they became a worldwide phenomenon. But yes, I have to mention Twilight. I feel like the whole Twilight phenomenon, the books, the movies, Robston, all the memes we have now, because we are rich with memes now, all of that all those years, however many years that was basically my high school years. I rode the Twilight wave all through high school, and I was definitely there for it. I got my mom into it. She was reading them. We would go see the movies together every time there was a new premiere. I loved it. Shamelessly, I loved them. Stephenie Meyer, she knew how to write to her audience, and so I think it proves that you don't even have to you don't even have to write necessarily in a way that's particularly good. You just have to be able to connect with your reader, and she did that. Like, she honed right into the sort of preteen female readership. They were probably maybe the first books that I really truly had the one more chapter feeling. Another thing that's important to mention too is it doesn't just have to be a life-changing book because it has like heavy literary merit. They don't have to have been, they don't have to be Pulitzer Prize winners to have changed your life. They just have to like have affected you in some way. And honestly, I feel like those books could have been almost anything. It didn't have to be vampires and werewolves specifically. Anything that really connected to like a teen female reader at the time would have probably done the same thing. And it was also like my first bit of spice. And I think that that's before we were even using the term spice to describe like, little sexy scenes in books. Like by the time they get to like Eclipse and Breaking Dawn, like that was the first time I'd read anything like that in a book too. So very important books for my formative years. Next we have something I previously just mentioned, which was Game of Thrones. Nothing else really, some things come close, but I just feel like that is probably single-handedly the most epic fantasy series maybe to have ever been published. Now I can't say that I've read very many other fantasy series, not very many to be completely honest. George R.R. Martin the writing is so good. He knows how to put so much drama and so much tension and so much character development, and obviously he's sort of famous for like killing people off. He spins a yarn like maybe nobody else in the fantasy realm. This was basically me graduating into an adult version of like The Cry of the Ice Mark and the fantasy that I was reading as a kid. I am just blown away by how intricate the plot is and how a person can keep it all straight. I feel like I don't need to justify these at all. I don't even need to talk about them like anymore because it's very clear that Martin is a master of the craft. He also does write female characters, not every single one of them, but he can write female characters in a way that doesn't always happen when males are writing. Like Sansa and Arya, I feel I was able to like really connect with them, and I feel like it's kind of rare sometimes when you're reading a female character from a male's perspective. And then kind of jumping off the back of Game of Thrones, through Game of Thrones I kind of found Outlander as well, probably from a list of like books that are similar to Game of Thrones. And I think she's maybe even still writing them. Diana Gabaldon, I think she's on like book 9 or 10 or something like that. I have only read the first 3, so I can't really truly say, I guess, that they've changed my life because I haven't read like the full series. But this was my introduction into historical fiction. I knew very, very little about, sort of like Scottish lore and history, but she writes characters and romance in such a way. Again, all of these are life-changing because they were in some form page turners, whether it was like something to do with the narrative or how compelling the characters were, or the tension or the romance or whatever it was. And she writes a book in such a way it justifies the length of them because they are hefty, each individual one. And then to think of the series being as long as it is, I don't know how many pages that is total. Thousands, easily, thousands and thousands of pages. But yeah, it was the first time that I don't even think I realized I was reading historical fiction, like that was even a genre at the time that I picked up the first book. I knew that it had that fantasy element because she goes through the stones. It's basically like Stonehenge, sort of, but it's magical and she goes back in time. It was my first introduction to a book where the romance is just as strong as whatever is happening with the actual plot, if that makes any sense, and the romance is like a driving force. I love that she is able to do romance in a way that makes the narrative stronger for it, because a lot of times I feel like it's not always done that way. If you're talking about like an atmospheric, sucks you into the world and everything around you disappears, Outlander is a good series for that. She writes in such a way it just makes you realize that like at the end of the day everything boils down to love, as cheesy as that may sound. Like it is the reason for everything, and those books embody that. And then obviously the show. I did like the show. Now, switching it up completely. I want to talk about like a whole publishing house. It's like a family run publishing house, and they are called $2 Radio. I discovered them, I don't even know how. It's been a while since I've like been reading their books and been familiar with them. Their whole thing is they publish books too loud to ignore, and books that a lot of times are maybe just like a little bit left of center, a little bit different, and a traditional publisher would not normally accept. I only have one of their books physically. I've read so many more, and I don't know why. I go through like a minimalist kind of phase, and I'm like, I don't need books. I want to practice non-attachment. Like, I don't need to own every book that I read. But then I kind of wish that I still did. This is one of them. This is the only ones. And it's kind of pitched as like an Aldous Huxley Brave New World, but with like a plague, near future, sort of apocalyptic landscape as the backdrop. I loved this. Definitely more like science fiction sort of vibes. They have a storefront. They have a physical store somewhere, I think in Ohio, which I would love to go visit one day and buy all of their books. This one was one that I really loved, very atmospheric. And then the first one that I actually ever read by them was The Orange Eats Creeps. Like, the creeps are vampires. Junkie, teen, homeless vampires are like the protagonists. This was the first book that I read where I was just like, what am I reading? And then The Crystal Eaters, I was obsessed with that one too. That one may be my favorite. It's set in a world where everybody is born with like 100 crystals inside them, and as you age you lose crystals, and when you hit 0 you die, something like that. Our protagonist is like a young girl whose mother is dying, and there's this elusive crystal, I think it's like the black crystal or something like that, and she has to basically go on this adventure to try to hunt it down and find it so that she can like save her mom. Really cool concept, really short book, beautiful. I loved it so much. So if you ever find yourself getting a little bit tired of like whatever's on the bestseller list at Barnes & Noble, and you end up, you know, kind of leaving the bookstore without anything, $2 Radio might be a good place to check. Okay, we're coming up on one that I feel like might be the most important. This was the first one that popped into my head when I thought of filming this video, and it has stuck with me and many readers, and it's super famous for a reason. If you take away nothing else from this video, I recommend this one, because this has single-handedly changed the way I think about the world and how I exist in it, and the government and its all-seeing eye, and that is George Orwell's 1984. If you don't know the concept of this, basically it takes place in a totalitarian, futuristic society. He was writing in the 40s, so 1984 was in the future for him. Sort of joked that this was like our government's instruction manual, because even though it is a dystopian novel, a lot of things that we experience in a first world country are exactly what he was sort of warning against. Everybody being monitored all of the time. Something he talks about is telescreens. So it's basically like a TV is like a two-way monitor. So it would be like having Zoom open all the time, and the government was always watching from the other side. You know, and you could argue, I recommend it if you are a free-thinking person. Then this should be required reading. I just see everything that relates to the government and personal autonomy a little bit different now since reading this book. And I always think about the way that history shapes like a person's worldview, or whatever a person believes happened in history, whatever we're told happened, how that shapes our worldview. So I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist now because of this book, because it does make you think, and I feel like no matter where you are in the world, whatever government you live under, you should always question everything. So I'll just leave that there. One that I feel like I have to mention briefly, even though I feel like we are smacked over the head with classics and needing to read classics and they're so important and da-da-da. That's fair. A couple of classics that I feel like were actually very important in my understanding of literature was, well, kind of anything by John Steinbeck. Specifically East of Eden. This was another assignment for, I think it was my junior year AP English class, and I thought I wasn't gonna like it. We were being assigned to this big, 600-page great American novel. I wasn't like super looking forward to reading it, but ended up loving it. Steinbeck writes beautifully. He writes super compelling characters. They did a really cool film back in like the 50s with James Dean. So good. It's atmospheric. It's just like this epic story, and the way that he writes characters is just so, and landscape too. Like he really can like set the scene. But yeah, his characters are just chef's kiss. Then something very different and a lot more fun is Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. I have since read every single Chuck Palahniuk work. There were a few that I DNF'd, and I know some of you got upset at me in my video, but I also feel like life is short and it's okay to DNF a book if you're not vibing with it. You can always go back to it later. And this is a book that you should read if you want to know how to write a plot twist. If you have not had this book spoiled for you yet, highly recommend reading it. It is like a 18 plus for sure. Would highly recommend reading it. The movie is epic. Chuck Palahniuk himself has said that the movie was an improvement upon the book. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but it is epic. The way it's filmed, the cinematography of it all, the actors, obviously. They really bring all those characters to life. But it's just basically a commentary on like modern society, but like without it feeling like the author's trying to shove all these ideas down your throat. It's just done in a really good way. Very fast paced. It's gritty. It's kind of messy and sticky, inappropriate at times, but it all makes the story better for it. So if you haven't had this one spoiled for you yet, highly recommend Fight Club. Then getting into some stuff that's a little bit more serious is a memoir that I read recently. So now we're kind of catching up with real time. I just read this like a year or two ago. It was a buddy read with my boyfriend, and we read Yeonmi Park's In Order to Live, a North Korean girl's journey to freedom. So this is her memoir escaping from North Korea. And doing my Reading Around the World challenge, I thought North Korea was going to be the one country I wouldn't be able to find a book from, but I have already read 2 from North Korea, because she wrote this one, her memoir, and then she also wrote While Time Remains. I'll put it on the screen. It's like a political science book. This is definitely not for the faint of heart. She basically grew up extremely poor, like 99% of the North Korean population. There's, you know, scenes where like her parents have to go off into town, like a ways away, and like leave her and her older sister alone for like a week with like a bag of rice and nothing else, and the bag of rice runs out, and they are basically like, they have to go out in the field and like catch crickets to eat. Like it's pretty rough. It's pretty intense. She is sold into sex slavery. She's trafficked because the person that she and her mom think that they can trust to help them leave turns out to be not a trustworthy person. So there's big trigger warning for that, and like sexual assault and all of that. It's a very grisly story. The fact that she is alive, because there were so many close calls that she had, is just a testament to the human spirit. Highly recommend this if you're looking for something that will take you out of like your very American bubble. I feel like anytime I'm having a day where, you know, I feel like I'm just like annoyed at something or getting frustrated or whatever, a scene from this will pop into my head, and I'm like, oh yeah, I have no right to complain about literally anything. I think she even has a YouTube channel. I think I've seen a couple of videos of her before, so you might check that out. And then of course, kind of wrapping up here, I have to mention some like body, mind, spirit type books. So we have A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle and The Law of Attraction by Abraham Hicks. These are like very different for sure. I feel like they're kind of hard to explain sometimes. It's kind of hard to put things like this into words, just because they're kind of like abstract, and a lot of it has to do with your emotions and like your inner world and your mind and your heart. But they're just like so important, and both of these have like radically changed the way that I like think and see the world, and my interactions with other people and people's reactions to me. I think both of those are excellent. And then lastly, I just want to talk about dark academia as a genre, because it's like quickly grown to be one of my favorites. I read The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which for me is like the foundational text. It's sort of like, honestly, a lot pales in comparison to Donna Tartt because her writing is so exceptional. But I also love Vita Nostra, which I think is going to be a trilogy. They're working on a 3rd book. Let's see. If We Were Villains was okay. Takes a while to get to the action, but it's still like a good dark academia one. Oh, The Atlas 6. So atmospheric. I love the, you know, the university setting. A lot of times it's like fall time. What else? Sometimes there's like a murder or a disappearance. There's something mysterious happening. Sometimes there's magic if it's like a supernatural type dark academic book, or something like that happening, something that's like metaphysical. And this genre has inspired me to work on this new story, this new novel that I have in mind. I've been brainstorming for the last couple of years now, but I recently started a writing course. It's like a 3-month writing course I just want to like try to take it actually more seriously than what I would if I was just like doing it on my own. So those are all of my books that I feel like in some way changed my life. You guys let me know in the comments if you had any that were similar, or that you feel like changed your life, and I will see you in my next video.